Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Liebre Lopez, and today we're going to inaugurate a video series on a critical history of Spanish. As you can see on the screen, this series is divided into three different parts. First, the colonial engineering of modern Spanish as a North Atlantic universal. This is the topic we will be exploring today. The second video will be about post-colonial Spanish and its linguistic ideologies, from Pan-Hispanism to Hispanophonia. And finally, decolonizing Spanish, border thinking, and the global Hispanophone. Now, why critical? This series is critical because, unlike other sources that you can find on the Spanish language, here we will be making emphasis on the fact that linguistic variation does not operate in a vacuum, does not just happen. Rather, linguistic variation takes place within a complex matrix of socio-political circumstances and decisions that shape the evolution of that language. So in this series, we're not so much focused on identifying and explaining the development of linguistic forms. Rather, we're interested in discussing human agency, political intervention, the role of authority and power when it comes to shaping the origin and evolution of a language, in this case, Spanish. So let's get started. The first step, as I said, is the colonial engineering of modern Spanish as a North Atlantic universal. Now, notice that the terms colonial and engineering presuppose a human agency behind the whole process. And that is precisely the point of making a critical history of Spanish. Again, placing the emphasis on a human will and agency behind the evolution of language. So in this first step, there is a crucial question we're trying to elucidate. How does a language emerge? So when a new language appears, this cannot be just explained away as a result of linguistic evolution, as if language were an isolated entity to be identified and explained in neutral terms. Rather, a new language emerges not just as a result of the development of new linguistic forms, but also, crucially, as the product of a new conceptualization of speech. In other words, let's suppose that we have two linguistic varieties that are linguistically the same. They have the same language components. However, we can still conceptualize the first linguistic variety as a language and the second one as a dialect. So that proves that the emergence of a language is not just a matter of mere linguistic components, of the lexicon, of the syntax of that language variety. Rather, it is also a matter of how do we frame that linguistic variety? What kind of prestige of literary tradition do we ascribe or manufacture towards that? Therefore, the birth of a language is, as it were, less a linguistic than a metalinguistic matter. Or if you will, it is a question of combining both the linguistic aspects and how do you frame those linguistic aspects from a socio-political perspective. So how does this whole process manifest itself in the case of Spanish? Well, there are three milestones that we need to discuss if we are to account for the emergence of what we now know as Spanish. The sponsorization of Castilian, which is a process that takes place in the 13th century by Alfonso X. The first Castilian grammar, which is published in the 15th century and written by Elio Antonio de Nebrija, and the foundation of the Spanish Royal Academy in the 18th century by Fernández Pacheco. So first of all, the sponsorization of Castilian in the 13th century. What we have to understand here is that the origin of what we now know as Spanish has to do with the intersection between language and politics in the Middle Ages. And what we find in the 13th century is that there had been a process of conquest of Visigothic Spain, whose milestone will be the Muslim coming in 711. And as a result, now in the 13th century, the Iberian Peninsula was split between Muslim territories, known as Al-Andalus, and a number of Christian kingdoms that agreed on some issues and disagreed on others. And in the 13th century in particular, we have a strong southward expansion of those Christian kingdoms that little by little are taking more and more territories from Al-Andalus. In this context, what we have are different Christian kingdoms, each of which writes Ibero-Romance in a different way and wants to claim its own national language. And Alfonso X wants to make Castilian an international language of prestige, as proved by his claim to the imperial throne. And what he does is, in a complex Iberian Peninsula where we have Muslims, Jews, and Christians, he establishes the Toledo School of Translators to sponsor the translation of Toledo's Arabic scholarship into the local Romance vernacular, in this case Castilian. This implies that all the prestige that was ascribed at that time to Arabic, the most prestigious language of the Iberian Peninsula in the 13th century, all that prestige will now be reappropriated by Castilian. Hence why, in the words of Joe Lavangi, despite or because of the reverence accorded to Arabic as the language of science and culture, this, Toledo's School of Translation, was a colonial project designed to grant Castilian the status of an imperial language, equal to Arabic or Latin. This is the start of the process that will convert Castilian into Spanish. And so in this fashion, we arrive to 1492, which is a crucial year in the history of Spain. Not only do the kingdoms of Castilla and Aragon get unified in the figure of the Catholic kings, but also the Jews from those kingdoms are actually expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, thus giving birth to the Sephardic diaspora and vernacular Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. And in this very same year, Elio Antonio de Nebrija pens and publishes the first Castilian grammar. He addresses this grammar to Isabella of Castile, who was more powerful than Ferdinand of Aragon, hence why Columbus himself also addressed his letters to Isabella as opposed to Ferdinand. In the prologue of this first Castilian grammar, Nebrija famously emphasizes the intractable link between Spanish language and empire. And his famous quote is as follows: "Language was always the companion of empire and followed it, such that together they began, grew, and flourished, and later together they fell." So what Antonio de Nebrija is saying to Isabella is, if you want to have a strong empire, such as the Spanish one that is now nascent, you need to have a strong language. And if you want to have a strong language, you need that language to have a fixed grammar, which is hereby presented to you in this book. This is the linguistic ideology that underpins this book. Now, despite these grandiose words and the place of honor that this work occupies within the monumental narrative of global expansion for the Spanish language, we need to be critical enough to think whether this work was actually as popular at that time in 1492, or whether this monumental character has been retrospectively ascribed to this work in the interest of nationalist agendas. And the fact is that, as explained by Miguel Martinez, I'll put the link in the description down below, when Nebrija publishes the first Castilian grammar, it is by no means a bestseller. It is hardly read, if at all, amongst his contemporaries. And it is not until the 18th century, meaning 3 centuries later, that this work gets actually reprinted. Therefore, we can conclude from this that the monumentalization of Elio Antonio de Nebrija's grammar as a milestone of the emergence of the Spanish language is actually the product of a much later linguistic ideology rather than a reality of his own time. Be it as it may, it leads us to the third step in the colonial origin of Spanish, which is the creation of the Spanish Royal Academy in the 18th century. This was the product of the disembarkment of Philip V, which in turn was the result of the War of Succession between the Habsburg and the Bourbon monarchies in Spain. The Bourbon prevailed, and as a result, they disembarked in Spain in the figure of Philip V. They imposed a model of French absolutism that favored the centralization of the state. Hence why one of Philip V's priorities when he disembarked in Spain was the unification of Spain's administration as part of what he deemed the Nueva Planta decrees. And as part and parcel of this administrative process of unification and centralization, the Spanish Royal Academy is founded in 1713 by Fernández Pacheco, Duke of Escalona and Marquis of Vienna. What we see here is the adoption of a new model of state and nation and the incorporation of language as a political object in the service of the monarchy. And now this institution, the Spanish Royal Academy, is going to incorporate functions that were once attributed to just the church or just the monarchy. This is perhaps best reflected in the adoption of the slogan Limpia, Fija y da Esplendor. As you can see, the imagery of the coat of arms is very resembling of the fire of the Spanish Inquisition, and it has on top of that the Spanish crown. All of these three elements, the slogan, the fire, and the crown, speak to that coalescence of the church, the academy, various personalities of the culture of the time, etc. This is best illustrated by the following quote in which Fernández Pacheco defends the adoption of this emblem. The emblem chosen for the seal of the academy is a crucible on the fire with this motto: cleans, fixes, and gives splendor. The crucible is an instrument used to purify, again, just like the Spanish Inquisition, fix and shine metals through the action of fire. The academy means that through hard study, it purges the precious metal of the Spanish language from the slag of those out of use or any malformed, strange words and sentences that have been introduced. So again, the Spanish Royal Academy of Language ascribes to itself the ability to purify the use of language. So in conclusion, whether it is through the 13th century sponsorization of the Toledo School of Translation by Alfonso X, or the 1492 publication of the first Castilian grammar by Elio Antonio de Nebrija, or the creation of the Spanish Royal Academy in 1713, the discursive construction of Castilian Spanish, from its beginning as a sociolect of vulgar Latin to a language that is worthy of literary tradition and honor, was not the result of an accident, did not happen in a vacuum. Rather, it was the conscious product of a century-long top-down form of language planning designed by highly influential Spanish humanists, such as Antonio de Nebrija himself, linguists and translators, in conjunction with the powers that be, with the Castilian, Catholic, and Bourbon monarchies, respectively. This process, which was always already in dialogue with conquest and colonization, this process took place also at the expense of many other linguistic varieties that have been historically repressed as unworthy of an equivalent literary tradition and prestige, both inside the Iberian Peninsula, for instance, Catalan, Galician, or Euskera, and outside of it, such as Ladino or Chabacano. Again, the emergence of a language is not just a linguistic matter, but it's also a meta-linguistic question. What kind of values and prestige do we ascribe to that linguistic variety? That will determine whether that linguistic variety comes to be a language worthy of literary prestige and honor, such as Castilian Spanish, or it's conceptualized as the broken form of a more prestiged language. I hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video on post-colonial Spanish and its linguistic ideologies. Thanks for watching.